And for my birthday, for Christmas, when I was really young, he like legally gave it. Not that I was gonna steal it, but he gave it to me, as a gift. And this was the first thing he gave me.
Eddie Van Halen. The name alone still echoes through rock history, but behind the blazing guitar solos and sold-out arenas lies a story few ever talk about. The fortune he quietly built and the life it secured for his son. This isn't just about fame, addiction, or tragedy. It's about money, control, timing, and the decisions Eddie made long before the final curtain fell. Some of it was intentional. Some of it was chaotic. All of it changed Wolfgang's future forever. Grab a seat as we reveal the legacy and fortune Eddie left behind. The fortune Eddie Van Halen quietly left behind. Eddie Van Halen didn't just walk away from the world, leaving behind iconic guitars and legendary solos. When he died in October 2020, he left something far more powerful behind. A carefully layered fortune built over decades, designed to keep working long after the final note faded. While fans mourned the loss of a guitar revolutionary, the financial machine Eddie created kept moving, quietly and relentlessly. At the center of that fortune were album sales that never stopped generating revenue. From Van Halen in 1978 to 1984 and beyond, Eddie's music didn't belong to a single era. It lived across radio, reissues, digital streaming, licensing, and international markets. Every time a classic track was replayed, downloaded, or licensed for media, money flowed back into the estate. These weren't one-time paydays. They were recurring streams, locked into contracts written years earlier. Touring was another pillar. Van Halen wasn't just a successful band, it was a global touring powerhouse. Decades of sold-out arenas, premium ticket pricing, and merchandise sales created massive upfront earnings. But, more importantly, Eddie's role as a founding member and creative driver ensured that his cut went beyond performance fees. His stake followed the band's name, its catalog, and its brand. Then there were publishing rights, the real backbone of generational wealth. Eddie wasn't just a guitarist, he was a songwriter and composer. Publishing ensured that ownership of the music itself remained valuable long after touring stopped. Add to that branding deals, endorsements, and the long-term value of the Van Halen name, and the picture becomes clearer. Eddie's wealth wasn't tied to his physical presence. It was designed to outlive him. That's where Wolfgang Van Halen enters the story, not as a footnote, but as the central figure. As Eddie's only son, Wolfgang became the primary heir to this carefully layered empire. He didn't inherit chaos. He inherited control, rights, revenue, and the responsibility of stewarding a name that still carries immense financial and cultural weight. That reality raises a question many fans never stop to ask. How did a man known for addiction, conflict, and self-destruction still manage to build something so financially enduring? How did a life marked by instability produce a legacy strong enough to secure the next generation? The answer doesn't lie in luck. It lies in timing, ownership, and the choices Eddie made when it mattered most. Choices that quietly transformed musical brilliance into lasting wealth. So, before moving forward, let's rewind and understand Eddie Van Halen's early life. Stay with us. Before the millions, immigrant roots and survival. Edward Lodewijk Van Halen was born on January 26, 1955, 2 years after his older brother Alex, to Jan Van Halen, a Dutch professional musician, and Eugenia Van Halen, who was Indonesian. From the beginning, the family existed at the intersection of cultures, a mixed-race household navigating a Europe that was far less tolerant than it appeared on the surface. That reality would soon force a decision that would change the course of their lives. By the early 1960s, Jan and Eugenia were facing increasing racism and social pressure because of their mixed-race marriage. Opportunities were shrinking, not expanding. In 1962, when Eddie was just 7 years old, the family made a life-altering choice. They would leave the Netherlands and relocate to the United States, not in search of fame, but to escape a future that felt increasingly closed off. The journey itself reflected their situation. They traveled to America by boat, spending 9 days at sea. Jan paid for the passage the only way he could, by performing music on board with a band. That performance was their ticket into a new life. When they finally arrived in Pasadena, California, the reality waiting for them was harsh. They lived in a single room inside a house shared with 2 other families. Eddie and Alex slept in one bed. They were immigrants who didn't speak English fluently, dropped into a country that offered little patience for outsiders. School was frightening. The brothers were frequently targeted and bullied, not only because of their accents and limited English, but because they were visibly different. This was before the Civil Rights Act, and the school they attended was still segregated. They were labeled minorities, isolated, and treated as such. Eddie later described the experience as terrifying, something difficult to even explain in words. Amid the culture shock and fear, music became their refuge. Their parents initially envisioned Eddie and Alex as classical pianists, pushing them into disciplined, structured training. But everything changed when the brothers encountered the Beatles. That moment ignited a shift away from classical music and toward rock and roll, opening a world that felt expressive rather than restrictive. Instrument roles soon reshuffled. Alex stopped playing piano and moved to guitar, encouraged by their mother. Eddie initially gravitated toward drums, even buying a drum kit using money earned from a paper route. But while Eddie was out delivering papers, Alex practiced and got better. Eventually, they realized the truth. Alex was the stronger drummer, and Eddie was far better on guitar. From that point on, everything clicked. Eddie immersed himself completely. He carried his guitar around the house, practicing constantly, wearing it as he moved from room to room. During this formative period, another influence entered his life: alcohol. At just 12 years old, Eddie's father introduced him to drinking, teaching him to use it to calm his nerves before performing, mirroring his own coping mechanism. What seemed like harmless advice would later become devastating. Still, the brothers pressed forward. By 1972, they formed a band called Mammoth, setting their sights on musical success. Neither brother wanted to sing, leaving a crucial gap, one that would soon be filled by someone who would change everything. But once the roles were set, how did this scrappy band turn into a business? Let's find out. Van Halen becomes a money machine. By 1972, Eddie and Alex Van Halen were no longer just practicing obsessively. They were actively chasing a future in music. That year, the brothers formed a band called Mammoth, built entirely around Eddie's explosive guitar work and Alex's powerful drumming. The ambition was clear, but the structure was incomplete. Neither brother wanted to sing. The band had sound, skill, and drive, but no frontman to carry it forward. That missing piece arrived in the form of David Lee Roth, a local teenager whose background stood in sharp contrast to the Van Halen brothers' immigrant struggle. Roth came from money, and with that money came confidence, ambition, and resources. He had tried and failed to break into music before, but when he encountered Eddie and Alex, he immediately recognized his opportunity. Eddie was hesitant at first, unconvinced that Roth belonged in the band. What changed everything was leverage. Roth's father had provided him with a state-of-the-art PA system, something Mammoth didn't have and couldn't afford. Roth used it strategically, offering access to the sound system in exchange for joining the band. The deal worked. With Roth on vocals and the later addition of bassist Michael Anthony in 1974, Mammoth's lineup was finally complete. Almost immediately, tension emerged. Roth pushed for accessibility and image. Eddie focused on musicianship and innovation. That friction would define the band for years, but it also drove their success. Roth soon urged a critical change. Mammoth, he argued, wasn't marketable. The band needed a name that carried identity and power. Reluctantly, the group agreed, renaming themselves Van Halen. That decision marked the first step toward turning talent into a brand. The band began grinding relentlessly. They threw their own shows, played backyard parties, printed flyers, stuffed lockers at high schools, and performed anywhere that would have them. Nights often meant 5 or 6 45-minute sets, bouncing across Southern California. The work was exhausting, but it built a fan base one person at a time. That intensity laid the foundation for what came next. Their turning point arrived on the Sunset Strip. While playing a bar gig for free, they were spotted by the president of Warner Brothers Records, who had come with producer Ted Templeman. The room was nearly empty, but the band played as if it were a stadium. Eddie's guitar stunned everyone in attendance. Within days, Van Halen had a record deal. Work on their debut album began quickly. Roth's pop instincts paired unexpectedly well with Eddie's aggressive, groundbreaking riffs. The label chose to release a cover of the Kinks' "You Really Got Me" as the first single, much to Eddie's disappointment, but the gamble paid off. In 1978, Van Halen was released and became an immediate success, reaching number 19 on the Billboard charts and cementing itself as one of the most successful debut rock albums of all time. From there, momentum exploded. Van Halen 2 followed in 1979, climbing to number 6 on the charts and solidifying the band's party-driven image. Relentless touring fueled revenue at a staggering pace. Albums were recorded in weeks, tours ran non-stop, and money poured in. Women and children first arrived in 1980, continuing their platinum streak. By this point, the formula was undeniable. Eddie was the engine. His sound, his innovation, his discipline drove everything. The band had become more than successful. It had become a machine. So as the money poured in, what did Eddie start pushing back against? Don't blink. Creative control, studio power, and ownership. As Van Halen's success accelerated, so did Eddie Van Halen's frustration with how that success was being managed. The band was selling records, selling out venues. The band was selling records, selling out venues, and becoming one of Warner Brothers' most valuable assets. The first real warning sign came early, when the label chose to release a cover of "You Really Got Me" as the band's debut single. While the song became a hit, Eddie was disappointed that one of their original tracks wasn't chosen. That decision planted a seed of resentment that would only grow with time. As albums piled up and touring intensified, record label pressure increased. Warner Brothers wanted speed, familiarity, and reliability. Eddie wanted originality and forward motion. The tension became impossible to ignore during the early 1980s, especially as the band was pushed to record albums quickly, sometimes in as little as 2 weeks. The faster the machine moved, the less control Eddie felt he had over the music that defined him. That frustration boiled over during the making of the band's 4th album, Fair Warning. creative differences between Eddie and David Lee Roth escalated into constant internal conflict. Eddie felt Roth had assumed too much control over the band's direction and was steering them toward spectacle instead of substance. In response, Eddie took a drastic step. He quietly seized control of the production process, sneaking into the studio after hours to re-record large portions of the album without the rest of the band knowing. Fair Warning became Eddie's most personal and experimental record to date. It was darker, heavier, and less accessible than previous releases. The process was intense and isolating, often stretching into the early morning hours. While the album is now regarded as influential, at the time, it became the slowest-selling Van Halen record of the decade upon its release in 1981. Commercially, it was a setback, but creatively, it changed everything. The following year brought even more frustration. After planning a brief hiatus, the band was pressured by Warner Brothers to return to the studio. Roth pushed hard for cover songs, believing they were guaranteed hits. The result was Diver Down, an album recorded in just 12 days, with nearly half of its tracks being covers. Eddie was openly dissatisfied with the process and the outcome. Ironically, Diver Down became a major commercial success in 1982, reinforcing exactly the kind of formula Eddie wanted to escape. That contradiction pushed him toward a defining decision. Eddie no longer wanted to fight for control inside traditional studio systems. Instead, he decided to remove the system entirely. He built a cutting-edge recording studio inside his own home, designed to give him complete creative isolation and autonomy. No label executives, no bandmates dropping in unannounced, no external pressure. From that point on, Eddie shifted from being just a performer to becoming an owner-creator. He controlled when music was written, how it was recorded, and what direction it took. For months, he worked alone in the studio, crafting material without interference. This control extended beyond sound. It meant ownership of the process, the recordings, and the long-term value tied to them. That decision planted the seeds of lasting wealth. By controlling production, Eddie ensured greater leverage over masters, royalties, and creative assets. What began as frustration with cover songs and label pressure evolved into a system where Eddie dictated terms. His music was no longer just released. It was owned, shaped, and preserved on his terms. That shift is a key reason why his fortune didn't fade when touring slowed. The foundation of long-term wealth was built here, behind closed studio doors. So when Eddie Van Halen secured ownership, how did it change everything? Keep watching. 1984, the album that changed everything. By the early 1980s, Van Halen was already one of the biggest rock bands in the world. But the events leading into 1984 pushed them into an entirely different financial stratosphere. The shift began quietly, behind closed doors, when Eddie Van Halen retreated into his newly built home studio and started working in isolation. Frustrated by label pressure, cover-heavy albums, and constant creative compromise, Eddie began experimenting freely, no longer constrained by expectations of what a Van Halen record was supposed to sound like. One of the most radical changes was Eddie's growing use of synthesizers. This move represented a clear departure from the guitar-dominated style that had defined the band. It was a gamble. Synths were not what fans expected from Van Halen, and even within the band, the new direction caused unease. David Lee Roth, in particular, was unsettled when he finally heard the material Eddie had been developing on his own. The sound was different. The balance of power had shifted, and Eddie was clearly driving the creative vision. Despite the internal tension, the material moved forward. When the album 1984 was completed, It carried that risk directly to the public. The gamble paid off almost immediately. The lead single, Jump, dominated radio and television, becoming the band's first #1 hit. Its success was global, not regional, and it pushed Van Halen beyond rock audiences into mainstream pop culture. The financial impact was immediate and overwhelming. Within a single year of its release, 1984 sold approximately 5 million copies, making it the band's most commercially successful album to date. The record didn't just sell, it reshaped the band's earning potential. With massive radio play, chart dominance, and constant rotation on MTV, Van Halen became unavoidable. Every unit sold multiplies revenue streams tied to album sales, publishing, and licensing. Touring followed the album's success, and the scale was unprecedented. Venues sold out consistently, ticket prices climbed, and merchandise sales surged. The 1984 tour became the band's most lucrative run, with packed arenas night after night. At this point, Van Halen was no longer simply successful. It was operating at peak commercial efficiency. Eddie's role as the sonic architect of the album translated directly into financial leverage. However, that success exposed cracks within the band. Until this point, profits had been divided evenly among the 4 members. As money increased, disputes followed. Eddie, Alex, and Roth began questioning bassist Michael Anthony's share of the band's earnings. They believed he did not deserve equal ownership in songwriting royalties and future profits. Under intense pressure, Anthony was forced to give up his songwriting credits and royalty rights, effectively reducing him to a salaried employee rather than an equal partner. This decision marked a turning point. Financial unity fractured just as earnings peaked. While 1984 was filling arenas and breaking sales records, internal resentment was growing. Roth's earnings increased, but so did his dissatisfaction. He wanted more control, more visibility, and a larger role beyond the band. Eddie, meanwhile, had proven something undeniable. His creative decisions now directly translated into massive financial results. By the end of the 1984 touring cycle, the numbers told a clear story. The album had reached #2 on the Billboard charts, produced the band's first #1 single, and generated record-breaking tour revenue. Eddie's earning power was no longer theoretical. It was measurable, proven, and central to the band's success. Yet, instead of stabilizing Van Halen, this peak moment set the stage for division. Just as the band reached its highest financial point, the forces pulling it apart became impossible to ignore. But as Eddie Van Halen's power peaked, what price was he quietly paying? Stay with us. Health, addiction, and the cost of success. The dangers beneath Eddie Van Halen's wealth did not appear suddenly at the height of fame. They were set in motion decades earlier, long before sold-out arenas and record-breaking albums. At just 12 years old, Eddie was introduced to alcohol by his father, Jan Van Halen. Jan, himself an alcoholic, taught Eddie to drink before performances to calm his nerves, presenting alcohol as a practical tool rather than a risk. What began as a coping mechanism quietly became embedded in Eddie's creative and professional life. As Van Halen's success accelerated through relentless touring and non-stop recording schedules, alcohol became a constant presence. The pressure to perform night after night, combined with Eddie's perfectionism, reinforced his dependence. For years, the financial rewards masked the physical cost. Album sales surged, tours generated massive revenue, and Eddie's earning power remained intact, even as his health quietly deteriorated behind the scenes. The first major warning came during the Balance Tour in 1995. Eddie began experiencing severe pain in his hip, pain that worsened as performances continued. Doctors eventually diagnosed him with avascular necrosis, a condition often associated with long-term alcohol abuse. The disease restricts blood flow to the bone, causing it to collapse over time. Surgery was recommended, but Eddie chose to delay it, prioritizing touring obligations over medical intervention. The decision allowed the shows and the income to continue, but it also accelerated long-term damage. While Eddie managed to keep working, the physical strain introduced new instability. Medical expenses increased, recovery time was needed, and productivity became unpredictable. Still, the financial structure he had built insulated him. Royalties, publishing income, and past tour earnings continued to generate revenue even when Eddie's ability to perform was compromised. His fortune wasn't erased, but the cracks were becoming visible. A far more serious diagnosis followed. During a routine dental checkup in the late 1990s, Eddie's dentist discovered abnormal scar tissue on his tongue. Further testing revealed tongue cancer. Eddie began chemotherapy treatments in Houston, Texas, while also exploring alternative medical approaches. A significant portion of his tongue was surgically removed as part of the treatment. Throughout this period, Eddie withdrew from public life, placing his career on pause while fighting the disease. Despite the severity of the diagnosis, Eddie eventually announced that he was cancer-free. However, doctors warned him clearly, if he continued smoking, the cancer would return. Eddie rejected that warning. He believed the illness had been caused not by smoking, but by prolonged exposure to electromagnetic radiation from studio equipment conducted through a metal guitar pick he often held in his mouth. Because the cancer had not initially spread to his lungs, he convinced himself smoking was not the cause and continued the habit. That choice proved costly. While Eddie's wealth continued to hold, the combination of recurring health issues, medical treatments, and extended downtime created ongoing instability. Touring slowed. Projects were delayed. Personal struggles intensified. Yet, the financial framework Eddie had built, ownership of music, control of rights, and long-term royalties, kept generating income, even as his body failed him. The cost of success, in Eddie's case, was not immediate financial collapse. It was erosion. Each illness, each postponed surgery, and each ignored warning chipped away at his ability to work consistently. His fortune survived because it had been structured to outlast him, but it was repeatedly threatened by the very habits that had once helped him cope with pressure. By the time Eddie faced cancer for the second time, the danger was no longer theoretical. His wealth remained substantial, but his health was no longer negotiable. The success that had once shielded him could not protect him forever. However, when Eddie Van Halen's body began to fail, who became his anchor? Keep watching. Divorce, isolation, and the role of Wolfgang. The collapse didn't begin on a stage, it began in private. When Eddie Van Halen's marriage to Valerie Bertinelli unraveled, it stripped away the last layer of stability in his life. What followed wasn't loud or dramatic. It was isolation, unchecked habits, and a quiet retreat from the world that had once revolved around him. The separation was announced in 2002, and over the following years, Eddie's personal life steadily deteriorated. By the time the divorce was finalized in 2007, the damage was already serious. The marriage had provided routine and grounding during years of illness, addiction, and professional uncertainty. Without it, the structure disappeared. Days blurred together, accountability weakened, and isolation became the norm. At the same time, Eddie's career stalled. Van Halen had no record deal, no stable lineup, and no clear path forward. Addiction filled the void left by momentum and purpose. Alcohol and substances were no longer occasional escapes, but daily fixtures. Those closest to Eddie saw the decline clearly. When Sammy Hagar visited him in 2003, he found Eddie living in severe disarray, physically unwell, emotionally fragile, and cut off from normal life. The discipline and precision that once defined him were gone. A reunion tour in 2004 was meant to reverse the slide. Instead, it exposed it. Eddie frequently appeared intoxicated on stage, struggled to perform consistently, and clashed with bandmates. Fans noticed. The band fractured again. By the end of the tour, Eddie had reached one of the lowest points of his life. Throughout this period, one person remained close: his son, Wolfgang. Growing up, Wolfgang had witnessed his father's brilliance. Now he was seeing the consequences: instability, decline, and isolation. He wasn't shielded from it. He lived alongside it. The turning point came in 2007. Van Halen reunited with David Lee Roth. But the real shift was Wolfgang joining the band as bassist. At 16, he stepped directly into his father's world. Touring together erased distance. During one performance, Eddie appeared drunk on stage. Wolfgang confronted him afterwards. This wasn't a professional dispute. It was personal. For the first time, Eddie was forced to see himself through his son's eyes. That confrontation shattered denial. Change followed. Eddie committed to sobriety during the tour, driven not by pressure or fear, but by responsibility. Isolation gave way to purpose. Wolfgang was no longer just witnessing his father's decline. He became the reason Eddie began to recover. But when Wolfgang drew the line, did Eddie finally listen? Let's find out. Sobriety, marriage, and estate stability. Change did not arrive through medical warnings or career pressure. It arrived through responsibility. After years of failed attempts to control his addictions, Eddie Van Halen committed to sobriety when his son, Wolfgang, refused to tolerate the chaos anymore. Touring together forced Eddie to confront his behavior daily, and the presence of his teenage son removed room for denial. Sobriety became a condition of fatherhood, not a temporary fix. Once alcohol was removed, structure slowly returned. Eddie remained sober throughout the latter stages of the 2007 tour, marking the first sustained period of clarity in decades. For the first time, performances were approached with discipline rather than survival. That stability carried into his personal life. In 2009, Eddie married Janie Leshevsky, reinforcing routine instead of volatility. The marriage reflected a reset, quiet, deliberate, and grounded in accountability. Health decisions followed the same pattern. After surviving tongue cancer and repeated medical warnings, Eddie quit smoking. The choice aligned with his broader shift toward preservation. Sobriety removed the sense of inevitability. Quitting smoking became part of reducing risk rather than tempting it. Eddie returned to touring under these conditions. In 2015, Van Halen embarked on a tour with Eddie fully sober, an unprecedented milestone. The shows lacked unpredictability, replaced by consistency and control. Each performance reinforced that longevity, not excess, guided his decisions. Behind the scenes, this period focused on preparation. Though Eddie rarely spoke publicly about mortality, his actions suggested awareness. His affairs were stabilized. Rights, royalties, and long-term income streams were no longer treated casually. Estate planning was handled quietly, without announcements, ensuring his catalog and assets were protected. There was no statement acknowledging that the end was coming. Instead, Eddie adjusted his life to protect what would remain. Sobriety reduced volatility. Marriage restored balance. Health choices lowered risk. Financial organization preserved value. By the time his health declined again, the groundwork was in place. The chaos that once threatened everything had been replaced by containment. Eddie Van Halen could not control how long he would live, but he ensured what he built would endure intact. Death, inheritance, and Wolfgang's new reality. On the morning of October 6, 2020, Eddie Van Halen's long fight with illness came to an end. After years of cancer treatments and declining health, he suffered a fatal stroke caused by complications from cancer. He was 65. The moment unfolded quietly, far from stages and spotlights, inside a hospital room surrounded by family. At his bedside were the people who mattered most in his final chapter: his son Wolfgang, his wife Janie Leszewski, his brother Alex, and his former wife Valerie Bertinelli. Eddie's breathing slowed as his body gave out, and with his last strength, he told those gathered that he loved them. At 10:14 a.m., one of rock music's most influential figures was gone. Eddie's death closed a public story, but activated a private one that had been carefully prepared. Because of years of quiet planning during his sober period, there was no chaos surrounding what followed. His estate did not unravel. His catalog, publishing rights, trademarks, and long-term royalty streams were intact and protected. The fortune Eddie built through decades of touring, recording, and ownership did exactly what it was meant to do. Wolfgang inherited far more than cash. He became the steward of one of the most valuable guitar-driven catalogs in music history. Control over Eddie's recordings, songwriting income, and brand legacy now rested largely with him. That inheritance instantly made Wolfgang financially independent. Not because of a single payout, but because of recurring revenue tied to music that continued to earn. The responsibility extended beyond money. Decisions about licensing, tributes, and the future of the Van Halen name became personal, not corporate. That reality came into focus in 2023, when Wolfgang publicly confirmed that Van Halen was officially finished. There would be no reunion tours, no replacement frontmen. With that declaration, Wolfgang stepped fully into his new reality. He was free to pursue his own music on his own terms, without financial pressure, while remaining bound to preserving his father's legacy, history, and name for future generations worldwide, permanently and without compromise or dilution, fully secured, intact, and assured indefinitely. So, what do you think? Did Eddie Van Halen's death end his story? Or did it transfer power, legacy, and control straight to Wolfgang? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.